Since October 7th happened, I don't know about you, but I've come to realize that Israel's fighting not one front war in Gaza, but of course the second front in the north against Hezbollah, the third front where rockets are being sent across from the Houthi rebels along the southern Arabian Peninsula, and there is disruptions in the West Bank. So if you imagine the geography, quite quickly you'll recognize that it's all surrounding the state, translating into the displacement of over 250,000 Israelis within the state, most of whom are living in hotels, some of whom are living with friends, family, relatives. I know my aunt's kibbutz in the north accepted 400 refugees. And it got me thinking, is that the only place we're fighting? And then unfortunately, as I watched time move on and on and on, as someone who loves social media, loves technology, likes to think of myself as up to date with all sorts of things, I noticed that the conversation in places like TikTok and Instagram and Facebook was no longer sympathetic toward the victims of October 7th, many of whom were brutally violated and murdered in ways that I am still traumatized from watching a video of. Things that I never would imagine we as human beings could potentially even imagine inflicting onto others. And that conversation shifted almost overnight to something blaming. And other people were claiming to be victims. And of course, there is more loss of life. And any loss of life is a true pity. And any loss of life is a loss of another one of God's children. And I'm reminded, of course, the lovely saying that comes from Eastern Europe that we have, that we imagine ourselves with both of our hands in our pockets. In one hand, we're supposed to remind ourselves that we are the center of the universe, and in the other, that we are just like a piece of land on the seashore. And if that's true for us, all the more so is that true for every human being on this planet. Every person can do amazing things, so every loss of life is all that more sad and tragic. And then the conversations turned into protests calling for free Palestine, and not recognizing that Hamas and the Palestinian people are not in fact the same. That the needs of the Palestinian people may not even align with Hamas, the terrorist organization that's been taken over in the Gaza Strip since 2005. A similar organization in terms of how it's run and who funds it to Hezbollah and to the Houthi rebels. And if you're getting where I'm saying, if you were to look at the conflict from a larger perspective, we see that it's really not just between Israel and the Palestinians, it's really between the US and Israel, the Palestinians, Iran, Russia, and China, all intertwining and playing things out in the Middle East in a way that's detrimental for the entire globe. But that's not the narrative that's discussed. And because that's not, I, as a Jewish person, will tell you, I felt maligned, I felt ignored, I felt judged, and certainly I have been excluded. And the points that I've made, while factually accurate, were not always heard or paid attention to. And I felt that way even more so for Thursday last week, and if you were with me last Friday, it might have seemed a little bit not quite myself. I had just seen the video that the IDF had put together, and it was still very raw in my own heart, the witnessing of the death of 185 people. their rape and their torture and what happened to them. And then I had the good fortune of attending the rally in DC, and I no longer felt quite as alone. I was surrounded by my Jewish brothers and sisters, 300,000 of them, who also were wondering where we were at in the conversation of what's going on in Israel. Did we have supporters? Were we alone? Because the funny thing about places like TikTok and Instagram and social media in general is that you can feel very much alone. You can feel as if your opinion is much the minority. And in being in an environment on Wednesday, which was the largest gathering of Jews in American history, I didn't feel alone anymore. I didn't feel quite misunderstood. And what a gift it was to see the leaders in Congress, from the Republicans and the Democrats, for whom they wouldn't necessarily even be ordinarily on the same stage with one another without, of course, bashing each other on CNN. And yet, for that moment on the National Mall, we got to see Chuck Schumer, the leading Democrat in the Senate, who's also Jewish, and Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, a Republican, speaking and saying that Congress offers its support for the state of Israel, and sharing that they too had just seen the same video that I saw, and sharing how it impacted them, and how they too saw the brutality of Hamas, a terrorist organization, and recognized the need to maintain active and continuous support for the only democracy in the Middle East. The democracy that didn't start this war, but the democracy that will not lose this war either. And as people gathered, it almost to a T ended their speech with the words, Am Yisrael Chai, people of Israel will live. I felt uplifted, as of course I cried. My daughter came with me and said, Mom, you're crying all the time, which I probably was, because it was so moving to not feel so alone. It was so moving to see that people who were standing on stage, and many of them public figures, were taking a risk, saying that they were going to support Israel in a time when it's not really popular to do so. They were going to stand up for the right thing, when other people who, by the way, I think they are also believing they're standing up for the right thing, aren't in agreement. I would love to see a Palestinian state exist. I would love to see an Israeli state exist. I'd love to see them coexist, and I'd love for everybody to get along together. That would be wonderful. Unfortunately, those words, I think, are more of a messianic hope and fantasy than a reality at this time. It's my prayer, of course, that we actively work toward that goal. But we may not necessarily achieve it or see it in our lifetimes. And I'm reminded of the Rabbi Tarfon quote, that even though the work is great, we're not free to desist from it. May the coming together on the National Mall inspire us to work for a time where there can be everybody living in peace and harmony. When once again, as it's described in the prophetic literature, songs can be sung in the streets of Zion, and there can be joyful, abundant growth of all sorts of fruits and celebrations in harmony together. We look in the end of the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah talks about and offers a prayer that may Jerusalem be a place, a house where all can come and worship together. I hope that prayer, which Isaiah said 23 or 400 years ago may eventually come to fruition. It hasn't quite yet, but being on that mall earlier this week gave me hope that it just might.